Today on Paralysis to Purpose.
The music was my practice of hate and violence. If I wasn't out actually committing acts of violence and hating people on one-to-one basis, I would listen to this music, which would basically serve the same purpose.
Yeah. Here we go. You can do anything you put your mind to. What seems impossible can be done by you. It may knock you down, but don't let it stop you. Got so much to give, a lot of life to live. You must go from paralysis to purpose.
This is Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast with David Cooks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I'm your host, David Cooks, and I say it every week. I love my job because I get to speak with some of the most inspiring and intriguing people in the whole world. And today is no exception. Let me tell you right now, put your seatbelt on because we're going to take an unbelievable journey today. Our guest today is an author. He's an author of two books, one called My Life After Hate, and the second is he's a co-author of the book, The Gift of Our Wounds. He is a speaker. He's a global peacemaker. He's a restaurateur, too. We're going to talk about that toward the end of the podcast. But he hasn't always been that guy or this guy. As a young man, he got involved heavily in the white power movement, and he was a founding member of what became the largest racist skinhead organization in the world. He also is a little talented in music. He was a singer in the race metal band Centurion. And, that band is still popular today. So it is a great pleasure and honor to have our guest today. He's a busy guy, so I'm just honored that he's here. And let's just give a Paralysis to Purpose welcome to Arno Michaelis. Arno, man, it is so good to see you, and thanks for coming.
Likewise, David, the honor is entirely mutual, and so inspired by your story and your work, and delighted to have this conversation with you.
Well, hey, let's get right to it. Let's go back to your childhood and just walk us through some of the thought processes that you dealt with that ended up you in a very dark place. I mean, you didn't start there, but you ended up there. Can you just share a little bit about your background and some of the decisions that you made along the way?
Yeah, so when you look at the background of most people who get mixed up in any kind of violent extremist ideology, you expect to see what they call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So if you see a violent neo-Nazi, you wouldn't be surprised to learn he came from a broken home or if suffered abuse as a child. I've been working in intervention of violent extremism for over a decade now, and I've worked with a lot of people from all sorts of violent extremist backgrounds, and the majority of them do certainly have those adverse childhood experiences, and really horrific ones as well. In my case, I'm a bit of an outlier. If you saw a 1,000-foot view of my childhood, it would look pretty idyllic. I grew up in a very well-to-do suburb of Milwaukee. I lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I never went hungry. I never took a beating. My parents were together, and they both loved me very much, and they let me know that at every turn. And I really had everything going for me. But underneath the surface, there was trauma happening that wasn't so apparent to outside view. And that was essentially my father's alcoholism. And I always clarify this, because when a lot of times when you say, I have an alcoholic father, especially if this is from a neo-Nazi or something, you're going to think, well, he was abusive, he was mean. My dad wasn't a mean drunk. He was what I call a fun drunk. And when my dad was drunk, it meant, which was every day, we were going to light off fireworks and shoot pistols in our basement pistol range. That's not normal. Like, but to me, that was normal. And I loved shooting with my dad. It was a lot of fun. And my dad like hung out with me and my brother a lot. It wasn't like he didn't ignore us. He didn't abuse us. But as much fun as the boys were having, this was not fun for my mother at all. And really, I think the crux of the issue was that my dad did more drinking than working far too often. And what that meant is that it was left to my mom to sometimes work 2 jobs to keep the lights on and the bills paid and food on the table in her nice house in a nice neighborhood. But the bottom line is it was really irresponsible, my father, and it really made life difficult for my mom. And they were constantly fighting. There was a lot of emotional violence between them. And again, my dad never struck her, and he wasn't necessarily, abusive in the classical sense, but just the distance that alcohol puts between you and your loved ones made things really difficult. And so I grew up seeing my mother suffer on a daily basis, and that hurt me. And I responded to that by lashing out at my little brother first. He was my first bullying victim, to an extreme. I know most big brother, little brother relationships have some degree of bullying in them. From a very early age, and this is the other element of this, is that my parents, both my mom and my dad, and all my extended family and all the teachers in my life were always just gushing about what a gifted genius I was. And when actually I was really just like kind of nuts. I do really crazy things. And my parents took me to the pediatrician. They're like, what is wrong with this kid? And the pediatrician, God bless him, rather than medicating me into oblivion, which very sadly I think happens all too often nowadays, my doctor, Dr. Montgomery, was just like, he does that because he's so gifted, and he needs stimulation that beyond what normal kids. He needs to explore. He needs to push boundaries and limits. And my parents interpreted this by pretty much just letting me run amok. As I grew older and I responded to my mother's suffering by lashing out at my little brother and then some kid on the school bus in kindergarten, and then the classroom at school, I started to get stimulation from causing this kind of chaos. Like it was like a rush to me. Alcoholism is a genetic disease. I'm an alcoholic myself. I drank profusely from the time I was 14 until I was 34 years old. So I'm very familiar with addiction and substance abuse. And my need to repulse people and to cause trouble as a kid was very much an addiction. And in the same way that when I started drinking at age 14, I think I had 4 or 5 beers and then I passed out. And then when I quit drinking at age 34, I could drink 18 beers in an evening and still function the next day. But the nature of addiction is the amount of the substance that gets you high the first time, 10 times later doesn't get you high anymore. And you need to keep escalating the intake of that substance. As a young kid, it got old just bullying a kid on the school bus by myself. So I got a bunch of other kids on the bus to beat this kid up, like take it to the next level. So if I'm doing that in first and second grade, you just connect some dots to see where I'm at 16. I go from that to fights in the schoolyard, to breaking and entering, to vandalism. I start drinking at age 14. I started listening to punk rock music, which I still love. I don't want to make it sound like punk rock some kind of gateway drug to becoming a white power skinhead, but just the rebellion and the kind of fury of the music was another part of that rush. And by the time that was getting old, I'm 16. I'm a full-blown alcoholic already. My whole life revolves around the acquisition and consumption of beer. And I have a habit for angering civil society. Like that's my real addiction. And that's when I was exposed to white nationalist hate groups through white power skinhead music.
Wow. So you that's an interesting that's a lifetime already. and you're 16 years old.
Right.
I want you to talk a little bit more about your parents, about a statement your mom made to you.
That quote from my mom happened in 1989. I was 18 years old, and I was at Thanksgiving dinner with my skinhead girlfriend. And at this point, I'm 2 years into white nationalism, and I'm very outspoken about it. Anybody I'm talking to, family, somebody on the street, whoever, they're going to hear about my racist views. And so, anyone who has an alcoholic family knows what my Thanksgiving was like. All the adults, except for my grandma and my mom, are rip-roaring drunk. It's just, that's a normal thing. And the food's great. The company's still great. It's just how our Thanksgiving was. And so now I'm legally an adult, if not old enough to drink. And so I'm rip-roaring drunk also with everybody there. I showed up drunk, and despite my mom's protests, I just kept, drinking with my aunt and my dad.
Right.
And as I'm at the table going on about the white race and yada, 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 the whole white nationalist spiel, my mom cuts me off, and she's like, "Well, Mr. Nazi, do you know that your great-grandpa Bordo was 1/16th Native American?" And I blew up. And it really, I don't know that I had been that upset in my teenage years until I heard that, because in these 2 years of being a white nationalist, I had constructed my entire identity around the lie of race. That not only I am a white man, but I am a white man fighting for the white race, which is under threat from this evil Jewish plot to kill all the white people on the planet Earth. And so everything everything that mattered in the world to me was my status as a white man.
I mean, moms are special.
Oh, absolutely.
Because she knew exactly what she was saying to you at that time. You had like a little bird, a little, woodpecker just pecking at you a little bit at a time about what you believed and what you were involved in.
Right.
How important was the music?
The music was absolutely crucial. Music is a form of practice. The music is like hyper violent. Our band's claim to fame was that every time we played live, somebody left in an ambulance. And it wasn't like somebody from outside that our audience attacked. This was our audience like beating each other to the point where they were hospitalizing each other. That's how violent and aggressive our music was. If you listen to that music every day for an hour a day, what effect would that have on you over time? And then to drive the point home, nowadays I've been head over heels in love with music my entire life. I still spend hours a day listening to music, and I love all of it except the racist stuff. I still love really hard, like death metal, fast, aggressive music. I love that style of music, and it really it illustrates the power of practice. When you dedicate yourself to something, as human beings, we're very familiar with practice, but we usually think of it in a voluntary sense. I want to learn how to play piano. I'm going to practice every day. I want to learn how to write. I'm going to write every day, or a sport, or what have you. But we don't think about things that we're inadvertently practicing. If we listen to AM talk radio station where there's some guy every day he's rah, 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 he's yelling about some group or this group, and he's angry, and we're listening to that every day and we're angry, like we're practicing anger, we're practicing blame, and we're making those things like part of who we are and part of our nature. And so I want people to like be aware of what they're practicing, and then ask themselves, is this something I really want to get better at? And I believe that process can be really empowering for any human being. But if going back to your question of like how important was music, the music was my practice of hate and violence. If I wasn't out actually like committing acts of violence, and like hating people on one-to-one basis. I would listen to this music, which would basically serve the same purpose.
Right.
And so that was how I maintained the lie, all of this whole suite of lies that is white nationalism, and formed an identity around it.
Wow. So you said a lot in that answer about the power of practice, and that whatever it is that we regularly take in, we're practicing that, whatever that is. And we just happen to be talking about music right now. And that music does have a spiritual aspect to it, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And we hear it about gun violence and every other things, we want to ignore that is reality. But when you put it in the context of you're practicing, you are actually practicing something as you're taking it in. That's another way of really addressing that issue. So you got involved in the music, you're doing your thing, and then you become a single parent. You become a single parent. Before you become a single parent, you went to a McDonald's and some black lady said something to you. All the people that you, another woodpecker,
absolutely
says something to you, and she simply said she saw that you had these tats on, tats, and she said, "You're a better person than that."
Yeah.
Now, this is someone that you hate. You're not supposed to like them, and she does not give you what you thought she would.
Exactly.
She says to you, "You're better than that." Take us through a little bit of that, and then go into becoming a single parent, because that was the beginning, I think, of you really having to rethink some of the things you were doing.
I love telling the story because it's so important to understand that an act of kindness and an act of compassion is never innocuous. Like it can always have the capability to change the course of someone's life. And so, and another really good point about this is this is in month 2 of my 7-year involvement in white nationalism.
Oh, wow.
That this occurred. And the point of that is that when we do commit an act of kindness and an act of compassion, very often it may seem we're talking to a wall. You're more likely than not going to have an immediate response. You're planting a seed, actually. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was I declared that war on anybody who's not white. They're my enemy by default. And I did so in hopes of receiving that fight. Like if somebody came up to me and swung at me and blasted me in the grill, like that's victory for me. Whether I get beat up or I beat them up, like that's my intention, is to provoke that kind of violence. And so I wanted black people of all ages, whatever. I wanted them to be afraid of me. I wanted them to hate me, and ideally, I wanted them hostile. Like I wanted them to fulfill the role of my enemy, which I'm trying to cast them in.
Right. And
instead, I walk into this McDonald's. There's an elderly black woman behind the counter. Just walking in, I'm taken aback by her because she has this beautiful smile on her face. Hey, I'm trying to hate black people, and you're making it really difficult now because you're this sweet elderly old lady who has this smile that's just completely blowing all my nonsense out of the water. So this is all making me very uncomfortable. And this is over 3 visits. So the first visit, I just come in there and get my food and run because she's making me very uncomfortable with her smile and her kindness. I go back again. She remembers what I ordered. She remembers me. And she asked me about the weather and my day, and I'm all the more uncomfortable now because this is like throwing me for a loop. This is contradicting everything I'm trying to believe about the world and about me and about everything. So the third time I go back, this is when I got a swastika tattooed on my middle finger. And when I saw her, the first thought I had was like, it was involuntary. I couldn't even control it. My thought was, I don't want her to see this. I don't want her to see the swastika. I was actually embarrassed to even approach this woman to get my food is I didn't want her to be offended. As much as I'm trying to hate black people, like her being like destroyed all that. So I'm trying to hide it. I'm trying to reach my pocket without showing the back of my hand to get my money. And she sees it. And she says to me, like my grandma would say to me when I was beating on my little brother, she goes, "What is that on your finger?" And I couldn't even look her in the eye. I just looked out at my boots and I was like, "It's nothing." And I'm hoping that like I could just get my food and get out of there. And she waits until my eyes rise and meet hers, and she goes, "That's not who you are. I know you're a better person than that." I wolfed down the food. I went home. I got drunk as fast as I could. I went out in the street and I attacked the first person I saw because I wanted to put as much distance between me and this incident that I possibly could. I wanted to pretend like that never happened. I wanted to like rip it from my experience. But the nature of human experience is that you can't subtract anything from it. Once something happens, that's part of who we are. She had the bravery to completely defy me and actually to put herself in a position of power. Like that was power. If she would have said, "Get out of my store, you racist piece of garbage," I would have made my day. That would have just validated everything I was trying to believe. And even though she would have been right doing so. But instead, by responding the way she did, she put herself in a position of power, and she put herself in a position to change the course of my life, because 7 years later, that seed remained in my heart. And it had actually started to germinate and bloom and blossom, and despite my best efforts to rip it out, with 7 years of hate and violence. And so in 1994, my last year, my girlfriend and I broke up, and I found myself a single parent to our 18-month-old daughter. And it was a couple months after that a second friend of mine was murdered in a street fight after a concert that my band had played. And by that time, I lost count how many friends had been incarcerated. And it finally hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. But all of these things had to fall into place. And I honestly think that if it wasn't for that woman's bravery, and there were other people who treated me with kindness, a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, Black and Latino coworkers, if it wasn't for their bravery and kindness, and if it wasn't for my parents refusing to give up on me, for all of their struggles, both my mom and dad were like, "Hey, we love you. We want you back. We want you to stop what you're doing, but we're going to love you no matter what." All of those things falling into place, like finally led me to a place where I said this, I'm done with this. And that's when I left the hate groups.
Well, I tell you what, I think this is a great place to take a really quick break and come back and pick it up there.
We hope you're enjoying Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Paralysis to Purpose for more updates. Also, check out David's website at davidcookspeaks.com to learn more about his mission and purchase his book, Getting Undressed, From Paralysis to Purpose.
There's a couple of things that you said that I want to maybe quickly talk about. Was this the only person in McDonald's? Was that the only line you could go to get your food? Why didn't you go to another line? And you said it was 3 times, that it were 3 different situations that you had with this woman. And I'm thinking, it's McDonald's. There are multiple people you could go to. That's the first thing. That's
in the long version of the story, David. I on visit 3, when I froze in the doorway with thinking about that tattoo and not wanting her to see it. That's exactly what crossed my mind. I'm like, is she the only person working here? I actually sat there for a minute. I'm like, they got to open up another line. Like there's got to be someone else working here. And I actually waited like a minute or two, hoping somebody else come to the counter, and it wasn't the case.
And then the other thing that I thought was very important was she didn't cancel you, and neither did your parents.
Exactly.
And I think that we need to have a real conversation about how canceling eliminates conversation, and it also eliminates transformation.
Thank you.
And we've got to figure out how not to throw people away and how not to discard them and to love them into change, because that's what your parents did. That's what the lady at McDonald's did.
Yep.
And without that, quite honestly, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, I don't think.
No, I agree 100%. And it's such an important point. I always preface this by saying and Pardeep's taught me the importance of this, is that I really think it's crucial that we do everything as human beings in a trauma-informed way, which means when someone is acting horribly, rather than say, what's wrong with you, we say, what happened to you? And we understand that behavior stems from suffering. I'm a Buddhist today. In 2014, I took what's called a refuge vow. It's like a voluntary Buddhist baptism kind of, and so Buddhism is my spiritual jam. And Buddhism 101 is that, hey, if you're alive, you're going to suffer. And the aim of a Buddhist is to help all sentient beings end their suffering. Everybody does suffer in one way or another, in one part of their lives or another. And fortunately, not all people who hurt go to hurt others, or we'd be in a lot worse shape than we are in. When we have a healthy means of processing our pain, that's when we can stop ourselves from transferring it to other people. I had all sorts of healthy means to process my pain offered to me on a silver platter throughout my life, and I failed to engage with them up until I was in my mid-20s. And it wasn't until then that I found a healthy means through a different form of music to process my suffering. So if we remind ourselves when someone's acting like that, they're doing it because they're suffering, that helps us respond to their aggression with compassion. And that is, I work with a lot of veterans when I do intervention work. I have a dear friend named Chris Buckley, who was an Imperial Nighthawk in the Ku Klux Klan when I met him, and an Army veteran and a methamphetamine addict. And working with Chris, I had to start thinking like tactically, thinking like in military terms. And so my objective was to reach him and let him know there's a better way to live his life. I'm a big dude. Like, people are afraid of me because I'm a big guy, and like Chris is a little guy, and it would have been completely feasible for me to like physically dominate him and to say, hey, you're going to change your ways. But the fact is, you're never going to beat the racism out of someone. You're never going to punish the hate out of someone. Like you said, David, the only way to do that is to show them what love looks like and show them what awaits them. If they can understand that they have just like a substance abuse issue, that they have a problem and they need help getting over it, and that most importantly, a better place awaits them if they put in the work to do that. And so this idea of cancel culture, which I think is very much a real thing. A lot of people go, oh, it doesn't exist. It's just consequences for your actions. To me, it's a continuation of this dominance approach to society that's been going on for a very long time.
I call it bullying on steroids.
Absolutely,
it's another form
totally
of
a form of bullying,
and it's like, I just don't understand it, and it's so counter to the ideology, or the perceived ideology of the people who are actually enforcing the cancellation. It's just the weirdest thing to me.
Well, but again, looking at it through a trauma-informed lens, which is what I do, because it angers me. When you talk about perseverance, David, and I think about times in my life when I'm persevering, at this moment, it's very difficult for me to persevere when people who claim to have the same objective that I do, which is to eliminate racism in our world and create a world. My personal mission statement is I want to bring about a world where all people are valued and included. Like, everything I do is I check it against that objective. I say, hey, is that going to bring about a world where everyone's valued and included? And I ask yes or no. If no, then I need to change what I'm doing. other people who claim to have that objective are the ones who are leading this cancel culture charge. And it is incredibly difficult for me to persevere when that's happening, especially when if I say something, I go, hey, this really isn't the right way to reach people. And then I'm told, well, because you're white, because you're a white straight man, like you don't have any say in this, or your opinion comes from a place of privilege and entitlement, and by the way, you're an oppressor. I don't blame. I see where all that's coming from, and by all means, let's have a discussion about that for real.
I think that is a much needed, difficult discussion,
right?
And I've said that, and I've been called a lot of names.
I believe it
that aren't very nice, because I just, wrong is wrong. And I don't care who you label or how you label them. When you're putting people in those positions, I just think it's not good. I want to then pick up on being a single parent. And also, I want you to talk about, you still were involved in music, and you got involved in a different scene, but it was still music and it was still energy, but it was a different vibe, a different energy. That was part of your transformation. So here's the question. You're a single parent at age 24, and you have a daughter, I believe, right? And that begins to change you in ways that you probably weren't expecting. What happened?
I'll never forget the day my daughter was born. And I watched her being whisked from her mother's womb to this little hamburger warmer looking thingy. And I looked down upon her, and for the first time in her life, she opens her eyes and she sees me looking down to adore her. And like, it would be great if like that moment, like, this is all wrong, I'm going to change. And I didn't change. A week later, I went out with my younger brother. We got rip-roaring drunk on this huge bar brawl. I came home covered with somebody else's blood. And mom was like, you are a piece of garbage. You're a father now. You can't act like this. And I responded to that by trying to kill myself. So it wasn't like this all, it was flipping a switch. But when her mom and I broke up and I found myself a single parent of this little 18-month-old girl, that's when it really, like, fatherhood really started to hit home for me. And I still had a very long way to go at that point. One of my most difficult mistakes that I struggle with is that for the first 11 years of my daughter's life, I was drunk or hungover for most of it. After I quit drinking, I've been really trying to overcompensate since then. And that's not always been a healthy thing for my daughter either. So it's a journey, but she's, my world has revolved around her for 26 and a half years. And she is an amazing young woman now. And I hung out with her yesterday, and any day I get to hang out with her is a great day.
Well, that's great, because we're on the Paralysis to Purpose podcast, and we talk about it's a journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a journey. Some people, it does happen overnight.
Right.
But for most of us, it doesn't. And
exactly.
We always focus on here on the podcast on the importance of perspective, perseverance, and partnerships, because I think those are three pillars that anyone who's gone through anything can talk about when they had a change in their mind, how hard it is to keep at it and to keep working, and then that they didn't have to make it by themselves, that there were people along the way that, whether you liked them or not, they were a part of nudging you, and that woodpecker that was pecking at you to get where you needed to go. So that's great about your daughter, and that you broke the chain. You broke the chain. I think that sometimes society makes you think that you can't change, that it's your DNA. If your dad did it, if his dad did it,
right,
uncle did it, you have to do it. And I want people to listen to this podcast, who are listening to this podcast, to know that you can break generational curses and habits and addictions that are in your life, and you can really change that. And call yourself what you want. If you want to be a recovering or a recovered,
right,
whatever language you want to use with that, know that you have the power to break that chain.
Absolutely.
All right. So your daughter's growing up. I mean, you've gone through 10 years, you're still drinking and all that and working through that.
Right.
And then you get into the rave scene.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the difference in when you were a heavy metal guy in that band, versus going to the rave, and the difference in how the music and the atmosphere and the vibe impacted you. Because I think it's important about the power of music.
Absolutely.
The power of practice. So now you've got something different. Go ahead.
Well, I'm so happy you asked me about that. That's really my favorite stuff to talk about is my rave scene days. And so I went from being a violent, outspoken white nationalist to going to rave parties on the south side of Chicago in the span of about 18 months. I went from extreme hate and violence to extreme peace and love. And for people who aren't familiar with the rave scene, the way that it's described often is kind of like electronic hippies. When I went to my first rave party, and the way this happened was after I left the movement, as we called it, I also left all my friends. I didn't have any friends now. The only friend I had was a guy who had like briefly dipped his toe in the movement and then said, yeah, this is lame. No, thanks. But he still talked to me, lucky for me. But then he started going to rave parties in Chicago, which meant he was gone every Saturday. And so I would want to hang out, and he's like, well, I'm going to Chicago if you want to come with. And I'm like, and it took a long time, but it took a good few months of sitting home alone on Saturday to finally be like, all right, dude, I want to go to one of these parties. Like, where is it? And he goes, well, it's in Chicago. It's on, and I'm like, okay. And so I'm like, pile in, I'll drive. And I drive down there, and we get down to Chicago, and nowadays this isn't as much of a thing, but back then, like, these were kind of illegal events. So you had a map point. Like, you would go to a particular record store, and you'd go in there, and then you would get a map that tells you how to get to the party. So there's this like clandestine element that was a lot of fun also. And we get our map from a record store on the north side, and it says the party's on the south side, like way, way on the south side. And I'm just all of a sudden, I'm like, no, I'm not going to the south side of Chicago. Are you out of your mind? Like, and I don't want to be racist, but I'm just like, I'm so conditioned. I'm like, black people terrified. I'm terrified of even going anywhere near the south side of Chicago. And my buddy like knew how to deal with me, and he's like, oh, okay, you're afraid. Oh, all right, I'm not afraid, let's go. And we went down there, and I'm terrified the whole time. And we get to the party, and it just absolutely blew my mind. And the music was like OG Chicago house music. And it was, the crowd was the most hyper diverse group you could have imagined. It was people of every ethnicity, every socioeconomic background, every gender identity, every sexual orientation, everybody coming together. And not only did no one care about these differences, everybody just like, it was like a single organism, all running to the time of this beat that just went throughout the night. And when I came out of that first rave party, I really felt like I was spiritually one with all of those people at the party. And that I was no better, no worse. I was valued, I was included, and that was carried through by the people at these parties. This is before I had all my swastika tattoos either removed or covered up. And so I would be at these, and after the first one, I was every single Saturday night. we were down in Chicago or a cornfield up north or whatever. I was always at a party for a good another 7 years. But the people in this scene, and mind you, most of these people are people I would have attacked on sight.
Yeah, I was going to say to you, this is not the crowd that you would have been in.
Not at all. And it's these are people who had every reason to fear me, every reason to shun me, and every reason to cancel me and to say, hey, you can get out of here. This is our space. Like, bye. We don't want you here.
Yeah.
But that's not what happened. It wasn't like I had to prove myself or I had to jump through some kind of hoop. And that's what's so important. Going back to this idea of canceling. When you show someone that you love them unconditionally, no matter what they've done or where they've been or who they were, that is the most powerful effect you can have on somebody. And that is really what brought me from where I was to where I am now. It was an absolutely critical part of this process. And for me, it was an incredibly transformative and healing period of my life.
Wow. Well, we're running out of time. I want you to just touch a little bit on your faith journey. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, and just the role that reflection and meditation, and eventually you've declared yourself as a Buddhist, and how faith has helped you on your journey, because you've overcome so many things. I didn't know all of this. I didn't know all of the addictions, and you were able to. You survived, man, and you're here. And I know that when I see some of your posts and about existence and different things, I'm like,
right.
I understand. I'm a believer in Christ, and so I do understand faith and other religions. And so I'm like, he's Buddhist. Can you just share a little bit about how important that is to you and what that has meant for you in your growth and your journey?
Well, it's interesting because I believe nowadays that the true spirituality is when you are inspired by other faith expressions and traditions rather than intimidated by them. And it's funny because Buddhism has brought me to a point where I love Jesus Christ. And I think he's amazing, and his teachings are fantastic, and that the world can't get enough Jesus Christ as far as I'm concerned, as a Buddhist. Prior to that, my entire life, I was opposed to Christianity from every angle you could imagine. My parents are both very secular stuff, so I wasn't raised Christian, and I grew up like really turned my nose up at Christianity, mainly because I saw it as a status quo. Everybody's a Christian. I'm not going to be a Christian. Oh, and by the way, if I turn this cross upside down, watch everybody freak out. Then as a white nationalist, and there are white nationalists who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ. And even back in my day, I thought they were ridiculous. And I used to get in fights with those guys. I'd be like, look, Jesus was a Jew, man. And it wasn't until I really started studying Buddhism and I started a meditation practice, which basically learned to be like, just sit and be at peace with myself, to see my post where I say existence is basically good. Right. It just means that like this existence we all operate in, whether that's you see it as a creation of God or the universe or whatever, it's a primally good thing. It's something to be grateful for at every waking moment. And honestly, especially when it's bad. I learned that from Sikhi and from Party. They call it Chardikala. It's a primally good thing to always be grateful for. And that became part of my faith, and it really resonated with me. And the more I studied the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, and one day I'm reading it and I just have this like epiphany. I go, oh, I'm like, if everyone was a Buddhist, there would be world peace. And I wanted to go grab people by the collar and be like, have you heard the good news about the Dharma? And I'm just like, whoa, who do you sound like now? And I recalled all the times I shunned Christians who were feeling that exact same spirit. And I started, like, it dawned on me that Jesus Christ is the embodiment of love, the embodiment of compassion, the embodiment of forgiveness. And if someone connects to those noble human qualities through the teachings of Jesus Christ, more power to them. Like that's beautiful. That inspires me, and I have a lot to learn from them. Now, I happen to connect to those things through the Dharma, but it's not an exclusive the Dharma is actually what opened me up to the value of Jesus's teachings. Wow. And so I love talking about that. I've done a ton of church talks nowadays, and that's one of my favorite talks to do. And that's really brought me to the point now where I've spent a lot of times. Some of my best friends are Christians. Seriously,
it's so funny just to listen to you, because if there's anything that I hope people get throughout this podcast, rather, is that you're on a journey of evolving.
Absolutely, yeah. You're
continuing to evolve, and underneath it all is a real human compassion and a real concern for people. If they can't feel that through this podcast, I don't know. They need to listen again. I mean, how about that? And listen and tell people. You are, for those who don't know who Pardeep Kalika is, I interviewed him. He's also a guest on our podcast, and we're going to have a podcast with Arno and Pardeep together and talk about their work that they've done together with Serve to Unite and other things. So you stay tuned for that, because that's going to be a powerful podcast from someone who has suffered loss at the hands of a white supremacist who partnered with a former white supremacist to now do work of good throughout the world. Literally, these guys have been all over the world. And that's why I'm just so honored that they're here. So that's who Pardeep is, if you didn't know.
Pardeep's amazing. Yeah, you definitely want to listen to his podcast. And we'd love to talk to you together, too.
Yeah, that's going to be, that right there is going to be really good. Finally, you're a restaurateur, and this is part of what's next for you. When I talk about you evolving, you have a love for food, and you are about to open up a restaurant here in the Milwaukee area. And I want to talk about that because there's more to you than being a former white supremacist.
Well, I appreciate that, David. That means a lot to me. Yeah.
And I think that sometimes I wanted to tell your story because it is a story of transformation and change, but sometimes we get stuck with the label that people call us. You're a former, or you're this. Yeah. Well, I'm that, and I'm this.
Right.
And we don't get to hear the "and I'm this." So I want to hear about your restaurant, whatever it is that you're able to tell us at this point about it, because that's part of your future.
So I have a dear friend named Alex Hanasakta. Alex is from Laos. He was born in a refugee camp in Thailand in 1980. And his father fought alongside the United States throughout the Vietnam War. So when the U.S. pulled out of the region, Alex's family had to flee for their lives. They were refugees. They swam across the Mekong with all their earthly belongings and Alex's older sister on their back. And Alex was born in a refugee camp in Thailand. The family came to Wisconsin, ended up in Burlington, which is a predominantly white, very rural area. They were the only Asian family for miles. No one spoke English. And Alex's dad would go to the neighboring farmers and he'd buy a whole cow. And he, long before anyone said, nose to tail, direct to farm to table, blah, 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 before those were buzzwords, Alex's dad would do that. He'd slaughter the whole cow, nose to tail, cook every bit of it, and then invite all the farmer neighbors over for a barbecue. And that's the way that his family connected with their community and went from being like outsiders that people were kind of freaked out by to actually a pillar of the community. And his father passed away about 11 years ago. And this is shortly after that is when Alex and I met. But Alex, when his father passed away, Alex wanted to kind of pivot to a culinary field. So he took his mom's egg roll recipe, which she came up with in the States. She used turkey and she used like potatoes and other things that you wouldn't find in Southeast Asia. And her egg roll recipe is unbelievable. He parlayed that into a series of pop-up dinners. He changed the name of the company from Mama's Egg Rolls to Sap Sap. And sap means delicious in the Lao language. So sap means delicious, delicious. We're very active on Facebook and Instagram. So anyone interested, if you just search for sap, SAP on Facebook or Instagram, you'll find our social media. Just when the pandemic hit, he had made a deal to open a brick and mortar location that was scheduled to open on March 12th of 2020.
Oh my gosh. How's that for bad timing?
Talk about perseverance. So Alex, like many restaurateurs, took it on the nose. He was out a big investment, very demoralized. There was times where he's like, I don't know, maybe I got to go back to working in a factory or something. This is devastating. I don't know that we can endure this. But then he got the idea to pivot to a curbside pickup menu and work out of a shared kitchen in Racine. And he started doing that in April of 2020 and was wildly successful. In July of last year, I was going through my own challenges with the pandemic. Alex texts me and he goes, hey man, would you want to come work with me on Sap? I'd love to have you as like an executive, but mainly as our storyteller, and also as our social impact leader. Because Alex, like community connection has always been very important to Alex. It's how refugees survive, and so he wanted me to basically do like Serve to Unite. I was doing Sap to Unite. So he invited me to come on. My first initiative was to connect him with an org I knew in Racine that helped homeless veterans in the U.S. military, which was a perfect connection since Alex's dad was a veteran, but not like an official member of the U.S. military. So he suffered PTSD his whole life, but wasn't able to get the help he needs. So now Alex is able to help this org, help other vets through philanthropy. We'd raise money from our pop-ups, and we'd also go and like cook dinner for these homeless veteran guys directly and have fellowship with them. And our first pop-up we did where we benefited this org was financially the most successful one we'd ever done. We're opening a location in Racine, and in our Racine pop-ups, people would drive from Chicago, they'd drive from Madison, routinely come from Milwaukee. And we've also built other pop-ups in Burlington and Milwaukee, which we do once a month. And with our home base, we're going to be able to scale those pop-up events outward. So we're looking forward to adding more of those. And we're going to continue to advocate for veterans and support veterans organizations, as well as advocating for refugees.
I had seen advertising about Sap, and we'll talk about that once we're done. I'm
going to hook you up, David. Next time, as soon as we're open and we're running, I'm gonna run you a care package.
Yeah, I need to. We'll talk about that.
I think you'll love it.
Well, before we go, if people are interested in booking you for conferences, workshops, whatever, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
That'd be via email, bookings at mylifeafterhate.com.
Okay.
Is
bookings at
that's how
bookings at mylifeafterhate.com.
Correct.
Okay. So that's the best way to get a hold of you. And then we've got for Sap. Just are we looking at
the website is sapsapeats.com. So SAPSAPEATS.com. And the people can learn more about my books at mylifeafterhate.com and giftofourwounds.com.
Great. And so we'll be having you back along with Pardeep, and we'll talk about the book, Gift of Our Wounds, and all that book has done. And I don't know if there's a movie coming or whatever. We'll talk about that. Yeah, we don't want to spill any of that information. But Arno, let me just tell you, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and your story is phenomenal. And the things that you've done since you've changed is what's really important. It's not. I tell people this all the time. For me, what I've done since I was 15 is what's important, not what happened to me at 15. Right. And that's part of the journey from Paralysis to Purpose. So thank you so much for being with us today. And until we come back with another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, this is your host, David Cooks, reminding you that your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
Thanks for tuning in to Paralysis to Purpose. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paralysis to Purpose on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. To purchase his book, visit davidcookspeaks.com. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring conversations with David Cooks.
So disability hits me, right, almost 16 years ago with the birth of my first son. And what I thought being a good father meant was getting your kids out, doing sports, hiking, sailing, skiing, the things that my dad did for me.
Next time on Paralysis to Purpose.
And so I thought I couldn't even be a good father to this child because I didn't understand sports and those kinds of activities were possible.
Paralysis to purpose.